natives, preferably the fast ones. So that just cut and dig and cut and dig and cut and dig. And so, anybody have any questions?
Sorry, I keep getting cut off. I do apologize. My internet has kicked me off twice now. So I don't see any questions about Himalayan Blackberry. I did throw in a link to CalFlora, so you can look at some images of Himalayan Blackberry if you don't already know what it looks like. For those of you who live in cities in particular, Himalayan Blackberry is covering fence lines and alleyways and just sort of takes over a lot of our local creeks and things like that. So if you see a really angry looking plant, as Evelyn said, with a lot of thorns and just, you know, a lot of dead stuff covered by some live stuff, chances are that that's
looking berries.
Just delicious berries that are really wonderful. And if, you know, if you want to make jam, they make a great jam, make a good pie.
Nice.
I highly recommend it. And it'll help get the seeds out of, you know, that area, which is great. But if you don't know what Himalayan Blackberry is, that's sort of what we're talking about, those sort of really urban areas that, you know, you see these fence lines covered in stuff. It's usually going to be some sort of ivy or some sort of a Himalayan Blackberry. And I do have one more question from me to you, Evelyn, and that is, how difficult or how easy is it to tell the difference between our native blackberry and a Himalayan blackberry?
Our native blackberry, I believe, is has many more prickles, but they're not as big and spiky.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
That's it.
Ashley, if I share my screen, I have a slide of the difference that I just happen to have.
Wonderful. Yes, if you could go ahead and do that, that would be great.
Did that work?
Yes. Nice.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah, so you can see
there's a similar native California blackberry, which is on the right.
Yeah.
And which does not act aggressively or invasively. It's just kind of out there in the forest and open lands doing its job. The Himalayan blackberry on the left forms these monocultures and thickets, and it spreads and covers. So the Himalayan blackberry typically has 5 leaflets. The California on the right has 3 leaflets. The stems, the spines on the Himalayan blackberry are like big shark fins, versus on the right, many more tiny round spines. And the Himalayan blackberry stem is kind of ridged. You can see that shadow.
Yeah.
And much bigger diameter, maybe 1/2 inch diameter or more in size you can get. And the California blackberry on the right is typically not even pink. It's usually a greenish bluish. So they're quieter, calmer plants, and probably growing more in the shade. Similar fruit. Typically the California doesn't fruit that much in my experience. And then the other trick that doesn't show on here, if you turn over the Himalayan blackberry leaf, the back of the leaves are really whitish. And if you turn over the California blackberry leaf on the right, the back is green, just like the top surface. So again, when we're trying to pull out the bad guy, typically we want to leave the California native blackberry. There's some cases like around vineyards where they don't want any blackberry for Pierce's disease concerns. So done. You will unshare me? Good.
I have a question for Evelyn.
Yeah.
If you chop the Himalayan blackberry stem as it's growing out of the ground, if you chop it down a certain distance, say 4 inches, would it resprout? You know?
Oh yes.
It would.
Oh yes. I was just looking at park up by in St. Helena next to the campus, and you could see there were some dead canes that they had chopped off and were lying there in a heap. And oh yes, everything was happy and 4 inches and just spreading out sideways. They'll definitely, you have to get the root out, and you need to follow the main lateral roots, the side roots, and get those out too. So, it can be a big job, especially if it's really old. I remember years ago we were out on an archaeology dig out at Dominican College, back when it was a college, and those mounds were probably 10, 12 feet tall, and there were homeless people living inside them because there's so much dead stuff everywhere that
yeah, they can create a fairly permanent structure. I mean, if you don't go in there and really lap them up and chip them, they will create a very solid mound. And it looks like it's a lot of living stuff, but as you mentioned, Evelyn, a lot of that stuff on the bottom is all dead stuff. So people can hollow that out and, make yourself a little Himalayan Blackberry igloo.
Yeah.
So I don't see any questions about Blackberry in particular. So again, letting people know that if you have questions about anything, feel free to throw them in the chat. I think we're coming close to the end at this point. I do want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. I really appreciate you coming and showing your interest in trying to control some of these invasive species that we have. And I mentioned this, I believe, before we really got started, that today in this workshop, that we are looking for other species, and thank you. I know a few people have entered in the chat a couple species that you'd like to focus on in future workshops. And Tom, I know English ivy is definitely one that we see in the city of Napa quite often, and really in any residential area, and even rural areas that have houses and things like that. And I've had a couple of people email me with different species that you want to focus on. So I do encourage you to do that. What was that, Evelyn? Vinca, is that another pretty major one here in Napa?
Along the creek banks.
Well, there's no end to the number of invasives that we could focus on. Yeah.
That's both the blessing and the curse of working with invasive species. And I've worked with invasive plant removal for probably 10 years. And sometimes it gets really overwhelming. And I do want to caution our volunteers, and Ryan mentioned this, that you can easily get burnt out. I mean, if you focus on just doing weed removal week after week, day after day, and you're out hiking and all you start to notice are the invasive species that are popping up, it can really decrease your enjoyment of the outdoors. So I do caution you to, yes, please volunteer with our invasive weed removal projects, but also do something else. Do something else that feeds a more positive feeling in your heart, because it can get really overwhelming. As Chip mentioned, working at Linda Falls for 20 years, sure, you see a difference over 20 years, but you go back after year 1 and after year 2 and after year 5, and oftentimes it can be really disheartening. So I do want to caution folks to not get burnt out and to not get discouraged. It can be very overwhelming, and is very overwhelming. And that's why we decided to start with a couple of species. And then once we get going, we'll add more species to our collection of workshops. So stay tuned. We will definitely have more. There's always more to talk about, that's for sure.
I have a sort of an interesting take on blackberries. If you took a blackberry, extracted a seed, and planted it, it probably wouldn't grow. It's meant to be eaten by birds, and it has to pass through the digestive system of a bird, have a little bit of the outside coating dissolved off in the digestive process. And it gets pooped out. It's got a little blob of fertilizer right with it. That's how they get around. But I thought that was interesting, how through evolution, it's got to go through a system of an animal to actually germinate.
But apparently not chickens. Chickens apparently are
Well, I think it's
effective.
usually a smaller bird. Probably
Right.
a chicken has got a little
Right.
more digestive juices going, so it's
Well, they've got
fucking
bigger
sparrows.
gizzards,
And
bigger crops.
if it goes through the system of an elephant, that probably wouldn't. kill it.
So what you're telling me, Chris, is that we should just get rid of all of the birds. We get rid of the birds and we won't have a Himalayan blackberry problem
sorry.
anymore. I think that's perfect.
Foxes
I
eat
love this
them,
idea.
Coyotes eat them. Bears eat them.
Oh, let's just get rid of all the wildlife.
Well, let's get rid
No,
of
all
us.
joking aside, all joking aside, we definitely we definitely have a lot of work to do in our invasives here in Napa County. And again, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. We got a little bit crazy there at the end, suggesting to get rid of all the birds. I apologize for that. I don't want to get rid of all the birds. They're lovely.
Ashley,
But
Ashley,
again, oh yeah, go ahead.
could I add something before you wrap up?
For sure, yeah.
I'd like to add something to what Chris said earlier. Just to explain what a workday in Westwood Hills Park looks like. Westwood Hills Park, of course, being identifiable, and I think that's it really helpful for having it serve as a template. So if we can be successful in an identified urban wildland park, then we can use that as a demonstration, very much like Moore Creek as well. But what a workday looks like in short is that people will show up. There's an orientation about safety. Of course, the presence of poison oak and the potential for dermatitis, how to clean up, how to use tools, how to operate safely. But in addition to what Chris said, it is a workout, but it's more than that. It's a social time. You know, it's a time where people get together, they meet people they may not ordinarily meet, and a lot of things happen, and a great deal happens in a short period of time. So I think in Westwood Hills Park, there's some good examples there where a few people, I believe that Ryan said this earlier, a few people can make a great deal of difference. And now that it's pretty much identified what Westwood Hills Park has for its 3 primary invasive species, where they are, that we have a tool that we can use to lead people to a place where they can be fulfilled, get a good workout, and have a good social time as well. So we can make a lot of difference.
And
Yeah, and
just to add slightly to that, for people who are not so interested in a big workout, you can also work with me in the butterfly garden down the hill by the parking lot next to the donuts.
Very good.
And you know, Kevin, you bring up a really good point in that we are sort of focusing a little bit right now on Westwood Hills, and that's sort of where this first endeavor has sort of taken shape for the volunteer portion of the weed management area. And the main reason for that is exactly what Kevin said: is that this is a park that's easily accessible. It has a really wonderful community that already loves this park and enjoys using this park and loves taking care of this park. And it's something that once we do demonstrate how this can work in this one park, we can then, you know, magnify it to a more countywide level. So you're absolutely right, Kevin. That is exactly what we're hoping to do with all of this. Definitely. I see a couple other just thank you comments and notes on other species that people want to focus on. So thank you. Keep those coming. If you haven't had a chance to put them in the chat, please do so. And like I said, if we get more funding, we will hopefully be hosting more of these workshops, and maybe even be putting out some kind of standalone, more permanent videos that sort of allow you to see kind of up close what some of these different plants look like and stuff like that. So stay tuned for all of that, and hopefully we can get out in the fields very, very soon. And actually do an in-person volunteer weed pull. Things are opening up a little bit with vaccines starting to roll out, and with our county regulations starting to change a little bit. And as soon as we are able to, we're going to organize something that will be in the field so that all of you can come join us and actually see what these plants look like while you're standing right there in your hands, and what that looks like within the landscape that you're going to be removing them from, which is a little bit different than viewing them on a computer. So thanks for bearing with us as we try and show you how this works virtually. We will, as Chip and Ryan were mentioning it will have to be sooner rather than later for one of these events. Otherwise, nobody will want to be there, and they'll be working really hard to try and pull French broom out of really, really dry areas. So we will hopefully be doing this sooner rather than later. So keep your eyes and ears open. And I just want to again say thank you to Evelyn and Kevin and Chip and Ryan, and also Tammy for joining us today and sharing your knowledge of sort of the volunteer stuff that you've been doing and also the background on the invasive species. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday morning. We appreciate it. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I will be sending out a recording of this workshop so you can share it, focus in on the different parts that that are interesting to you. And then I'll also include the PDF that Evelyn shared along with a couple of links to some of our species that we talked about. So does anybody have anything else that they want to share? Any of my speakers or any of the audience members have anything they want to share before we close it up and say goodbye? Silence means no. So have a wonderful day, everyone. And thanks again for joining us.